Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to give it a couple of more minutes to allow more people to jump into the call. But thank you very much in advance for joining us today on this webinar. Great. Thank you, everyone, and good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar on the investor's role in the fight against AMR. My name is Claudia Martínez. I am the Director of Research at the Access to Medicine Foundation, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today and to moderate this discussion that we are co-hosting with the World Health Organization as part of World Antimicrobial Awareness Week. As many of you know, and I don't think I have to reiterate this, AMR remains one of the most serious challenges facing health systems around the world. And 10 years ago, the WHO already declared AMR as a global health threat. Since then, I think we can all agree that awareness has grown, as well as global efforts to tackle AMR, but we still have a long road ahead. AMR now claims more lives than HIV/AIDS and malaria combined, and unfortunately, those numbers are expected to rise. We know that the impact will be especially severe, and it's already especially severe in low and middle income countries, where more than 80% of AMR-related deaths happen today. But also we know that treating resistant infections requires longer, more complex, and more expensive care. And if we continue on this trajectory, AMR will not only be a health problem, but also an economic one that could end up costing the global economy trillions of dollars. Today, we're here to talk about the role of investors, as well as other system stakeholders. But investors have a unique role to play by engaging with companies and actually rewarding some of the responsible practices that they may be implementing. They can help drive transparency, encourage better stewardship, and also advocate for both new and existing antimicrobials to be accessible for those who need it most. At the Access to Medicine Foundation, we're focused on helping industry move in that direction. Our research and engagement, including our upcoming AMR benchmark, which will be published in March, will be spotlighting some of the examples of how companies are performing, which areas we are seeing a lot of progress on, but critically, where the gaps still exist. This gives investors, policymakers, and companies themselves the insight that they need to take practical and meaningful action. So with that, I'm very excited to welcome our incredible panel. I will briefly introduce them. We have Dr. Valeria Gigante, team lead of the AMR department at WHO, who will be helping us set a bit of the scene, but also share the public health and policy perspective on AMR. We are also joined by Dr. Jaideep Gogtay, who is Global Chief Medical Officer at Cipla, who will be providing some critical insights from the standpoint of a pharmaceutical company working very intensively on these issues. We're also joined by Maria Souza, who is Senior Impact Analyst at Baillie Gifford, who will be highlighting the investor perspective that we're trying to sort of tease out in this conversation today. And last but not least, I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Evelyn Wesangula, Senior AMR Control Specialist at the East Central and Southern Africa Health Community, who will be sharing regional insights and also implementation experiences from LMICs. Throughout the webinar, please, everyone who's joined, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A box. Our team will be monitoring this, and then towards the end of the session, we'll do our best to answer as many as we can. Over the next hour, we're going to be focusing mostly on practical ways in which investors and other partners can actually make a difference. I've already told all of my panelists that we want to bring some really good examples, lessons learned, and also forward-looking opportunities just to make this conversation as useful as possible. So with that, I want to kick things off with Dr. Valeria with my first question. So Valeria, you have extensive experience guiding AMR interventions and policy since 2017 at the World Health Organization. You have been working particularly among many other things on R&D and innovation to mitigate AMR. So I wanted to ask if you can give us a quick overview of the current state of play. And also if you can tell me a bit about your priorities, because next year we are seeing a new high-level meeting happening in Nigeria to discuss AMR. So, Dr. Valeria, over to you.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for the introduction and also for the kind invitation. I'm really honored to be with you today and with our co-panelists to talk about a little bit more the AMR innovation and how we can shape better our ecosystem. So, as you correctly point out, WHO recognized the AMR as one of the top global health priorities. And just recently, we published some surveillance data that tell us that AMR is on the rise. We are seeing resistance increasing by more than 40% in some drug-bug combination. And our projection also estimates more than 10 million deaths annually by 2015. We also published recently, just last October, our latest WHO antibacterial clinical and preclinical pipeline analysis that gives us a kind of dramatic picture of the R&D space. The development is declining, down of 10% since our previous report. The pipeline overall is shrinking and fragile. We identified 21 candidates in clinical development that are expected to have some activities against our WHO priority pathogens. But progression actually is very slow. We have only 5 candidates in phase 3, that is the last stage of clinical development, with 3 candidates under regulatory review today. But what is really important to me is innovation, and clinical innovation is quite limited today. We identified 15 candidates as innovative, but only 5 of them target our most critical priority pathogens. And most candidates, and by most I mean approximately 80% of candidates in clinical development, are derivative of existing class, where mechanisms of drug resistance are well known or established. The pipeline today is also dominated by small biotech. And by small biotech, I mean startups with 15 to 10 employees, sometimes with less than a year cash flow. Only 6 large companies today are still active in advancing antibiotics. Also, over 90% of clinical programs are led by developers in high-income countries, and this creates a significant barrier for access for in LMIC. And since the last report, 10 products have been discontinued development. Let's compare now with the oncology. In 2024 alone, FDA approved 50 novel cancer drugs, while globally only 17 new antibiotics have been approved in the last 8 years. So the data are dramatically discouraging. So the pipeline overall faces this dual crisis, that is scarcity and the lack of innovation. And to fix this broken model, we need to invest in innovative financial mechanisms that they link volumes, but also de-risk investment. And we've seen an incredible progress with PUSH, with PACE, INCATE, Enable, CARBEX, GARP, Innofin, the AMR Action Fund, that have been also investing in diagnostics, vaccine, therapeutics. But PUSH alone cannot bring products to market. We really need the pull incentives that to reward the R&D and ensure access, but also stewardship. Some mechanisms are gaining traction in different countries. We have like a positive example, and also the European Union is supposed to finalize the general pharmaceutical legislation, which also includes a multi-country pool incentives for antibiotic R&D in the form of a transferable exclusivity voucher. So we are all waiting for this positive change. But aligned to the 2024 political declaration of the Young on AMR, priorities to enhance coordination for the AMR response include also strengthening the One Health collaboration. Currently, only 45% of countries have multi-sectoral coordination mechanism, so we need to do a little bit more there. We are updating from the WHO and the quadripartite side, the global action plans on AMR. We are working towards the establishment of the independent panel on evidence for action. We are strengthening reporting and surveillance, and we are enhancing global governance instrument. And actually, you mentioned the upcoming high-level ministerial conference on AMR in Nigeria. This is part of the annual high-level ministerial conference, and this surely represents for us a critical opportunities to align global governance with the financing and accountability. And without urgent action, AMR will remain a silent pandemic with catastrophic effect on health, but also on our economies.
Thank you so much, Valeria, for the reflections. And I think something that I take away from this first, and maybe already thinking about some of the insights that Evelyn will be bringing into the discussion in a couple of minutes, more on the, actions that need to take place both at the global, regional, and also national level to actually make the change. But something that I think is a key concern for us in general is what you refer to, a very thin R&D pipeline, but also the lack of innovativeness that we're seeing on this pipeline as well. I would like to turn to Maria now. Maria, you have a background in biology and public health. You've worked at UNICEF on different projects on water, sanitation, hygiene, also across Africa. You are now at Baillie Gifford exploring how investments can help improve health outcomes. We know, and I think this is how I started off this discussion, is that shareholder pressure can actually play a very important role in encouraging companies to address AMR risks. So also sort of looking at the challenges that Valeria has outlined already, can you explain to us how do investors actually engage with companies to drive action on AMR?
Yes, so thank you so much for the invitation and the kind introduction as well. So I just need to make a distinction, which is I work with long-term investors, and their role then is not simply to screen and score companies for a short-term cycle of profit. And why am I emphasizing this? It's because it gives us more opportunity to build stronger and long-term relationships with companies. And that in turn means that we can engage with companies to conduct not only the very normal thing you may expect investors will do, which is due diligence, but we can on relevant practices, but we can actually, sometimes we have the opportunity to learn from leading companies and to even cross-pollinate practices influencing others. So at the most basic level, stewardship expectations on AMR from long-term investors are very clear and consistent. Large pharmaceutical companies and animal health companies, they are expected to commit to responsible sales and use practices, transparent reporting, and alignment with global standards on waste management and manufacturing practices. So I consider this basic because these practices, they serve as a form of risk protection. So following regulatory standards protects companies, protects investors, protects our clients, and the entire health system, which ensures that everyone's returns are not eroded by the actions of a few. And so in engagements, we expect to see these guardrails because they stabilize the system that we are investing in, which are healthcare systems. But AMR is more complicated than that. And I think that's why we are having a deep conversation in this. I'm certain that if you are in this webinar today, you already know that this is not about public health, humanitarian concern, or sustainable development goals. AMR is more complicated because without antimicrobials functioning well, we don't have modern medicine. Okay, so I think investors are starting to wake up to that reality. And as you know, Valeria gave us a very important data. And so there is a change in perspective that I think we should help and enable investors to do. So the engagements to protect antimicrobials also change in perspective. And one of the ways I think we need to do is that protecting antimicrobial effectiveness is about safeguarding the foundations of value creation in life sciences, and at a minimum, the healthcare portion of portfolios. So I think there is room for us to continue advancing the idea that antimicrobial resistance and effectiveness are not solely problem related to infectious diseases. It is a system level investment risk. Why am I making this point? Because as I mentioned before, much of our engagements with companies is about risk management. So we need to transform more and more AMR as a risk management system level problem for investors. But I don't think we are doing much of this type of AMR system level engagement with companies yet. But there is a more effective way to get investors to drive actions on AMR if we continue championing innovation, but not in a silo. So as Valeria said, we need new antibiotics, but if we bring new antibiotics, if they are launched into a broken system, they will simply be eroded again with time. Cancer treatments will not be used if we don't have antibiotics to help treat patients undergoing cancer treatment. So the change in engagement that we need with companies is to help them to understand that emphasizing innovation plus stewardship plus access means that we can engage with R&D driven companies to discuss how they can explore subscription models. This is something that investors can do, and we should do more. We should also ask cancer treatment production companies to explore partnerships of surveillance, of diagnostic integration. And with all science-based companies, I think we need to talk to them to increase immunization awareness. But we are not doing that much yet. We know that this must be done, but this is how I think we should have more investors acting on AMR.
Thank you very much for those very, very, very valuable insights. I think the point around addressing AMR as a systems level risk is something that it's critical for us to be able to continue to advance both in these conversations and actually how do we go about implementing some of the actions. And you also talked, Maria, about some of the things that investors are doing and can do more of. And with that, I would like to actually go to Dr. Jaideep to tell us a bit more, and just starting off from the starting point of Dr. Jaideep, you are Global Chief Medical Officer at Cipla, and you have had extensive experience introducing drugs across multiple therapeutic areas, including reintroducing older antibiotics, also leading some of the company's AMR initiatives. I wanted to ask you, just to Maria's points earlier, how does a company like Cipla translate your performance on AMR into a value proposition for investors? And how do you feel that perhaps can be, I don't know, improved maybe?
So first, thank you, Claudia, for having me here. And Maria, some of the words that you mentioned, and Valeria, the problem that you laid out is amazing. I mean, it's, I live in Mumbai and in India, and we know that India carries a large burden of not just infectious disease, but unfortunately AMR as well. So the way at Cipla, we have been looking at this, and I've been leading this project in Cipla for the last 5 years, on how as a large generic company based out of India, should we be looking at AMR? One is on the investor side. I think we still have to do a lot more for investors to ask the right questions. So a lot of questions that we get are more on sustainability, of which AMR seems to be a small portion, because we are still looking at water, we are still looking at energy, in our sustainability. We are looking at all the other things, climate, but AMR seems to still have a small portion of that. So we do get occasional questions from investors on AMR, but I don't think they're really looking at the company performance from the view of AMR, what you, I think, mentioned. I think we need a lot more education there of investors, especially in countries where the burden is high. So it's ironical, where the burden is high, we don't get those questions. So I would be really happy to have those more questions. On the other side, as a company, when we look at AMR, I think we are faced with a very, I would say, one key issue is how do you balance public health versus the individual patient who is sitting in front of the physician? So when we meet with doctors in hospitals or primary care doctors, they tell us we need new antibiotics. So as a company, you jolly well have to get a few new more for CREs or ESBLs, or even now we have colistin resistance in India. So we did set out this, and we in fact introduced about 2 antibiotics in the last 3 years as a company. But the other way we've equally looked at is, can we use non-antibiotic strategies to help patients? So for example, like what Claudia mentioned, we have brought back old drugs. We've recently brought back a very old drug called methamine hippurate, which has been used for preventing recurrent UTIs, which more recently we had some very good data coming out of the UK, demonstrating that it was almost as good as giving prophylaxis with an antibiotic like nitrofurantoin for recurrent UTIs. So we've just introduced that in the market, and we believe that these kinds of initiatives will also help in reducing the consumption of antibiotic use, although it may be a small contribution. So I think as a company, we are looking at both antibiotic development and launches, as well as some unconventional sources. On the manufacturing side, which is, I think, an equally responsible thing for a company like ours, we have been doing what is called, started work on certifying some of our antibiotic manufacturing sites. In the sense that, the supply chain today is very complex. The API may come from somewhere else. The formulation may be made in either our site or in a contract manufacturer site, because there are special requirements for beta-lactams. You need separate lines for penins. You need separate lines for monobactams. You can't make other drugs in the same line. So it's pretty complex. So we've been working on certifying some of our antibiotics at our sites. There are some BSI kind of certificates available, which controls the amount of discharges or the amount of antibiotic discharges into the effluent systems, which are below a certain limit. And we've actually finished certifying a couple of antibiotics right now. And we've now started putting it into our sustainability goals. So although it's not an independent AMR goal, I think what people like to see is if it's part of your sustainability goal for the company, AMR is a component of that. I think, and I'm hoping that investors will actually warm up to it. So that's how we are thinking right now. But I think it's very important, Maria, as you said, to educate investors that this is a systems problem. It's going to impact each and every one of us, whether we have the infection or not. This is going to impact everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaideep. I think I'm going to save a couple of my comments already for the second round, because you've already proposed a couple of very concrete solutions that are being implemented that I think I would like to go back on. But I'm very, very excited to hear now from Dr. Evelyn. I think mostly from your experience, very extensive experience, having worked as Kenya's national AMR focal point. Now you are at the East and Central and Southern Africa Health Community. And your work, and I mean, probably you can explain it much better than I could, is actually on the ground trying to get countries to operationalize their AMR plans, right? From your perspective, I really want to understand, what do you see as perhaps good examples of partnerships that you have seen perhaps with pharma companies that can actually help strengthen stewardship, improve access, and actually address some of the AMR priorities that we urgently need to tackle?
Great. Thank you very much, Claudia, and really great interventions from the previous 3 speakers. I want to appreciate the invitation that we've received just to come and share our experiences from the ground. And I want to pick up from one of the comments that Dr. Jaideep just made, the balance between public health and individual patients. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road. And I see that as a challenge, and it's really not about, it's both aspects of looking at the possibility of having newer antimicrobials, but from where we sit even access to the existing antimicrobials is still a problem. So as you get these comments and the requests and the cries for newer antibiotics, we are thinking, what about the existing antibiotics? Are they still available? And last year, ahead of the UNGA meeting with the Africa Union through the Africa CDC, we tried to look at the existing landscape on access to antimicrobial agents. And one of the things that really surprised us was that 65% of the antibiotics reported to be used were actually skewed just towards 4 antibiotics. So what happens to the rest of what is in the market? Is it a question of better use in terms of stewardship, or is it a question of access to what is really, really needed at the end of the day? So those are the balances that we try to address in this part of the world. As much as we need the newer antibiotics, but the existing older antibiotics, are they available when they are needed? So that brings me now to the conversation around plugging in and partnerships at the government level, because I work with governments a lot of times. And I think for the last couple of years, direct engagement with industry has been minimal. And yet in our conversations and our recommendations always is that we need to have more R&D, we need to engage with more industry players, but how does it work out? And I think that's why this kind of conversation is important, to try and strengthen the partnerships at the end of the day, because finding ways that work for both industry and the government and the teams that are leading these processes becomes important. We've seen an increasing improvement in the way that pharmaceutical companies or diagnostic companies are now interacting with what we call the National Antimicrobial Resistance Coordinating Committees. These are the teams that actually lead the implementation of national action plans. They are the teams that define stewardship interventions and how this needs to go through. And we have very good examples, for example, from diagnostic companies that apart from just bringing on board diagnostics, they couple that with capacity building on diagnostic stewardship, really to be able to improve the capacity for the teams to understand how to use the equipment or how to carry out their diagnostic procedures in a better way, linking up clinical teams with the laboratory teams, for example. And we're also seeing an increase in the way that the teams are now interacting with the pharmaceutical companies. Like this week is the World Antimicrobial Awareness Week. So we are seeing a lot of engagement in terms of building capacity and education, not just limited to the public health professionals or the healthcare workers, but the public as well. So what I see is that the ground is shifting and we are warming up to each other, which I think initially was a challenge, because then was the question of, is there a conflict in terms of how we are going to engage? But now, when we have realized that we need everyone around the table when you're making recommendations, I am seeing participation of industry in technical working groups, for example. On surveillance, we need data. And we know the pharmaceutical companies have very good data that countries don't have access to. They have data on surveillance, and that's why you're able to be guided on what molecule makes sense in the next couple of years. And some of this information is not available in countries, especially that have weak surveillance system. So I'm seeing an increasing interest in terms of conversations warming up and opening up between industry, and that's both pharmaceutical industries and the diagnostics. And that participation is actually strengthening the use of available data. And it's also helping to guide the kind of decisions that are being made. My last intervention is on a conversation we recently had at the continental level that was hosted by the Africa CDC on access to antimicrobials, diagnostics, and vaccines, that actually brought together pharma companies and those that are in diagnostics, together with the teams that are leading AMR programs and other partners on the continent. And for me, that's really a very big milestone that has broken like the walls that have traditionally existed between the different partners. So that's important. And that actually emphasizes that all these players are interested in aligning to the national guidelines, for example, for stewardship, or aligning to the national action plan interventions that have been proposed. So we see a lot of that. And the last one is the partnerships we see every other day with professional associations in building capacity. So I think those are great opportunities that are already forming, and we are seeing everybody knows that this is a public health good, and each of us actually is contributing to its protection. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I think this is actually the perfect segue into my next question, because I did promise our attendees ideas and solutions, and Dr. Jaideep already spoke about non-antibiotic strategies. Maria has been talking about how can we better articulate the story to investors. And Dr. Evelyn, I think the examples that you brought in terms of what you've seen in terms of, these partnerships between diagnostic companies paired up with capacity building, initiatives in surveillance are really, really important interventions that we need to see. And we do need to hear and see more of these examples so others can also follow suit. But I would like to turn to Valeria now, because I think another solution that I think you have been working on and you sort of have explored a bit, and perhaps you would be interested in telling us about is, for example, solutions that you have seen that could help scale up approaches that can actually help us with the innovation and access problem that we have now, such as repurposing existing compounds or any other ideas that you may have. How do you think, how is this playing? I mean, my question is, how is this playing out? And also, how do you think these insights can also help guide investors to influence companies?
Thank you so much, Claudia, for this reflection, actually. What we're seeing is that in this race against bacteria evolution, we are surely losing grounds. And all the traditional intervention for the AMR responsive alone have not been enough and sufficient so far. We really need to identify some approach that are completely disruptive to anything else that we have been trying so far to try to move these needles. And the recent advancing in AI and machine learning are really transforming the way that we were traditionally approaching drug discovery. AI, for instance, can screen through millions of molecules, cutting time and cost really dramatically. Let's imagine that some time ago, the traditional way where we studied and conducted our PhD could take a PhD student between 4 and 10 years of research to identify a potential compound. While today AI can really screen libraries between a few days, but also in few hours. And an important example was halicin, that was discovered by MIT in 2020 using deep learning, repurposing products from diabetes to potential antibiotics. But let's remember that the way, from identifying compounds until having a medicine that is safe and effective with quality standards, and the path is still very long. It can still take between 10 and 15 years. But surely, AI-driven repurposing and design can accelerate innovation. And this also has been applied within AR strategy. For instance, in modeling and simulation, we've been using models to predict dose response, especially for children, reducing the numbers of children needed for clinical trials. So the application of AI-based technologies really are important for drug discovery, but also through the whole R&D pathway. And today are also being discussed and debated in other domains of the AMR response, including stewardship and surveillance. But what is really critical is equity. In AMR, we have this dual paradox that the burden is concentrated in some region of the world, like Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, that are very far from R&D and AI-enabled research, where they are really actively developed and deployed. So AMR innovation need a proper contextualization that is actually a barrier otherwise for its appropriate use. So partnership between academia, investors, governments, industry can really accelerate this innovation. And this innovative solution needs to have two critical components. It needs to be globally relevant, but also locally appropriate. And the country most affected by the AMR burden should be really adequately representative, should have voice in it. And support the access to AI-based solution in LMIC is a critical step to close these gaps. Also, the research around AI technology today risk to be very fragmented, even in high-income countries. Let's think about the elite academic institution where research is mostly localized today. Could risk lacking inclusiveness and might also misalign with the needs of the most affected region. And so again, this fragmentation could once again exacerbate inequalities in AMI. This is why we really need a strategic prioritization and alignment between the global AMR and medical needs, the AI capabilities, and also the local expectation. If we want to really advance AI research meaningful, but also advance policy and practice to support its deployment. And this is critical, I think, to guide investors in identifying meaningful opportunities. So the first step we should all think about is to establish a shared roadmap that is based on equity, access, trust, partnership, and collaboration. AI, I think, is really important, is really meaningful, innovative solution, but it's also not a silver bullet if it's not deployed responsibilities. So we really need these collective efforts around a partnership for a safe and equitable deployment to help us regaining some grounds in this race.
Thank you so much, Valeria. And I think something that you've said that really resonated with me just now is sort of the need for having it, and I think it goes back to the point that Dr. Evelyn was making earlier, the globally relevant interventions, whether this is AI or anything else that we're willing to implement, but also locally tailored in a way that we're also addressing some of the risks and challenges on the ground for the people who ultimately we are trying to benefit from these interventions. So I wanted to go back to Maria now. And actually just now we had a really interesting question in the Q&A box that I'm going to try to weave into the question that I want to pose to you. So you talked a bit about, the role that investors play, the need to sort of address some of these challenges from a systemic level. The question that I have is like, do you feel that investors fully recognize the unique and really urgent role that they play in protecting antimicrobial effectiveness? The question in the chat is more around, actually understanding a bit more sort of how, even though sometimes we might be shaping this and communicating this as a systemic risk, maybe this is not yet landing with companies. And the biggest challenge is the fact that companies are aware of the systemic risk, but it's very difficult for them to be able to drive implementation without other pieces falling into place, like regulation, for example. So in a very long question for you, I just wanted to understand, what do you see as priorities and what tools, what concrete things do you think could help the situation?
Okay, so the idea that investors or even companies fully recognize the role in protecting antimicrobial effectiveness, for me, is that not yet. Some investors, they may recognize AMR as a problem, they may even know it individually, but they do not yet recognize it, as I placed it before, as the hidden infrastructure of modern medicine. So, but I don't think the challenge here is awareness. I think the challenge is salience. For investors, AMR is diffuse, it is perceived as slow, it's everywhere and nowhere. So it doesn't feel financially real, and it's really not financially visible. So behavior science tells us that investors, they will act when a risk is vivid and concrete. at present, AMR is neither. So we need to shift to this. And the idea is that we need tools that will make these financial consequences of, antimicrobials not being effective anymore, more visible in ways that investors can immediately, grasp. So for example, one idea that we started talking to a few partners is portfolio shock simulations. So which would be building tools that can show what happens to long-term returns in oncology or in transplant medicine or in AI-enabled drug development, on women's health, on surgical robotics, which is all areas that investors make a lot of money. What will happen if antimicrobial effectiveness collapses? So this is a way that we bring salience to this problem and we start waking up investors to the needs that we have. Another one is, like I said before, salience-driven reframing. So one thing I really like what the climate teams have done, climate colleagues, let's say, they went from carbon emissions to energy security. We need to drop bacteria killing people, and we need to say AMR must move from resistant bacteria to innovation security or portfolio durability. Because when investors realize that their most promising, expensive therapies will only work because antibiotics are effective, the issue becomes material. And then we can start having engagements that are very different than we have before with companies, and start bringing these opportunities to companies to participate from more partnerships and protect their products. So we can also consider antimicrobial effectiveness dashboards and metrics in risk screens. So we need to bring it to the reality of the investors day to day. They receive risk data all the time, but nowhere is to be found, probability adjusted loss of clinical effectiveness, exposure to resistant infection in clinical trials, reliance of antibiotics for marketed therapies, or vulnerability in supply chains. So this would make AMR more quantifiable. So ultimately, I think that with more salience, investors will recognize their role once they see that antimicrobial effectiveness is something that they already rely on, but they are never priced. and that's the failure that we need to help the markets correct. So our job, I think, is to make that invisible dependency visible, and to build these tools, the narratives, and the financial mechanisms that turn this responsible action that we want investors to have into more aligned, and in my case, long returns.
Thank you so much, Maria. I think probably there will be reactions from the panel to some of the ideas that you've shared in terms of, how do we make this visible and financially material, and I guess the data that we actually need to kind of bring this to life. With that, I want to go back to Dr. Jaideep, because I think you already laid out a couple of really concrete strategies that Cipla is implementing, certifications of antibiotic manufacturing sites. You talked about integration into your sustainability goals, which I think is a very valuable one that I would like to highlight in terms of, what does it mean for a company to truly prioritize some of these issues in a very concrete way that also drives accountability. But the question that I wanted to ask you is, do you have any examples of how, via your engagement with investors, and I know you've mentioned that you would like to get more questions from investors as well, but how have these engagements also played a constructive role in actually shaping your AMR strategy? Across some of the areas that you've already mentioned, and also very happy for you to share any reflections on any of the other interventions that we've just heard.
So I think one has been thinking about this always a lot for the last few years, but I've still not seen investors really coming up with those hard questions. As I said, and one route to it has been through the route of sustainability. But I dare say that potentially, as we go ahead in this whole challenge of AMR, investors first often ask you, what are the new products you've introduced in the last 1 year? And what's your plan in the next 3 years? And I think if companies are able to lay out a strategy that as we are bringing in more new, for example, what Maria said, cancer drugs, or better immunosuppressive drugs for transplants, or others. But equally important is encourage companies also to bring at least one anti-infective. Because as was pointed out, some of these therapies will not work if we don't have something to protect the patient from there. So it's like, what's the use of undergoing a knee replacement, which is so common nowadays, if you were to get hit by an MRSA or some other nasty bug in the hospital. I mean, that's all money down the drain, the patient is unhappy, everyone is unhappy. So I think these kinds of potential things that if we are able to talk to companies that please bring the latest things, bring surgical robotics, bring everything, but please also encourage companies to work on one anti-infective or how do you save your current anti-infectives? I think what Evelyn mentioned was so critical. While on one hand, we talk about excess, we also have a problem of access. It's a very, very unusual situation where you have both as a problem. I also look back at what happened in HIV/AIDS way back in the late 90s, and Cipla was an active participant in the AIDS work. How the world came together, or during COVID, how the world came together. For some reason, we are still struggling to get people together for AMR. And I think Maria rightly pointed out, it's everywhere, but it's nowhere. Unless an individual gets hit by an AMR problem, I don't see them waking up to the problem of AMR. I just had a case where somebody spent 29 days in hospital and huge amount of money because was hit by a post-operative bad gram-negative infection. So 5 days became 29 days in the hospital and the ICU, and I have no idea how much it cost. So as individuals get hit, perhaps that is when truly people will ask questions. So if I have to talk of any solutions, potential for investors, one is bring more anti-infective products along with your cancer drugs. For every 5 cancer drugs introduced, can you bring one of this? So is that something that investors could start asking questions? We want you to bring the latest therapy. I want you to bring the latest CAR-T therapy for cancer or for autoimmune disease. But hey, CAR-T also causes neutropenia. And how are you going to protect patients from that? So what are you doing towards that? So maybe that's a question that we could start asking ourselves. I also believe, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of non-antibiotic solutions can be there for certain problems. As I mentioned, typically recurrent UTIs, there are recurrent RTIs that people have. I gave one example of what Cipla has been working on and just brought into the Indian market. These could be things that we could study further. In fact, we started looking at this only after the European guidelines updated their guidelines for the treatment of recurrent UTIs with methamine. This is perhaps where WHO could also encourage, as part of the AMR strategy, actually list out 1 to 2 such interventions that could be encouraged. And finally, from an access point of view, what Evelyn said, we had a very great system for pre-qualification for HIV, for other drugs, which brought about access. I know it's happening in other areas as well, but this is an area that one could also discuss. Which are the 5 critical antibiotics that need to be brought into, let's say, parts of Africa which don't have them? Whatever it is, we are going to need antibiotics, the reserve category or the watch category into most parts of the world. So maybe that's something that Health Organizations Access to Medicine Foundation could take up. For example, I'll just close by saying that when we are launching 1 or 2 antibiotics in India, if you have to bring them to Africa, there's a different requirements for the dossiers than what India requires. And that becomes a bit challenging when the dossier requirement is different. Is there something that could be done at least for AMR kind of products compared to the standard drug? So this is something that we can really debate about, and I'll stop here. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And again, this, I think, creates a nice segue into my last question for Dr. Evelyn in terms of what you were saying just now, Dr. Jaideep, about the need to better understand some of the gaps and also understand what kind of interventions would be most appropriate. And my question, Dr. Evelyn, is, sort of, can you tell us about maybe one or the most important unmet needs that you see, particularly in the East, Central, and Southern Africa region, that you think investors should really be aware about? And how do you feel that we can encourage pharma companies to address it? Also understanding, some of the recent experiences of better partnerships that we're seeing and more engagement. What are some of the key things that you would prioritize for the region?
Okay, thank you, Claudia, and really, again, very interesting points that have come from the previous speakers. And I think every AMR conversation tends to leave us with more questions than we came in with. And I again want to build up from what Dr. Jaideep just said. And as we were having this conversation, I kept thinking, why are we not getting it right? We got it right for TB, HIV, and malaria. When every border was locked, we kind of got it right for COVID as well, because there was something that brought us together. Where is the political will to bring all these players to the table and make those decisions on the 5 key products or antimicrobials that need to be present at any one particular time? And I think I go back to what Maria said. For TB, HIV, malaria, and COVID, we had an immediate need, and there was an immediate market for uptake, and nobody argued about it. And that's why we got all this for HIV, TB, and malaria. All the generic companies came in and supported our countries to make sure we have accessible, safe, and quality assured medicines available for the population. And I think for AMR, the same problem of an unreliable supply chain still persists. And for as long as that persists, then for us, even questions around stewardship will never be fully, addressed, because at the end of the day, the bottom line is the user. Are the products getting to the user? Are they available when they are needed? Are they accessible? Are they affordable when they are required? Will the integrity be preserved, throughout the process? And that takes me back to the entire supply chain, right from R&D to selection to procurement and distribution. And it takes me back to data and surveillance again, because all these other problems that were won successfully and were able to build resilient supply chains, we built the systems and the supply chains with data. For the key public health issues that I've talked about, we had data on the burden of disease and impact on the populations. We had data on consumption that guided us, even when we didn't have burden of disease data. Do we have similar data for AMR that can help us build these systems to a level that will say they are resilient and that they are reliable ultimately? And that again brings me back to that place of who convenes and makes sure that pharma is on the table, that they have a role to play in shaping policy, for example. Are they shaping policy? Are they contributing, or are they on the sidelines and speaking, and then their contributions get into policy? So I think the place of better political will and commitment, because that goes beyond sectors. It is who is willing to drive and make very hard decisions to make sure that the needs that we are putting forth are actually felt as immediate needs, and that, yes, this is tangible and this is required. So I see challenges along those particular areas. So you've talked about regulations, and I know we have a lot of conversations around right now on the continent about harmonizing regulation so that it's easier to introduce new products into the market. So that's an ongoing conversation. And again, the scales, in terms of the economies of scales, we're also looking at pooled procurement. Sometimes you have very small markets, and this is not attractive to an investor. It's not attractive to any pharma industry. So we are now having conversations around that, so that we are able to make sure that we have reliable supply chains. And when that happens, I think we'll begin to address some of the challenges. And it's not just for medicines, but for diagnostics and vaccines as well. So for me, I think one of the things that's missing, and if we can bring on board better political will and a stronger force to bring all these aspects together, then we are going to have better outcomes at the end of the day. So maybe I will stop at that and see. And I think for industry and the investors, I thought about this. Are we waiting to be invited to the table? or are we going to come and say, look, we have a solution? Because that's what has happened to make sure that our other public health crises were actually resolved. People came and said, we have a solution. Government said, we have a problem. Investors said, this is what we can do. And I think ultimately it was a win-win situation for everybody. Thank you. Over to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much. And we're about to close, but I want to finish up with a bit of a reflection and a question that was shared in the Q&A box that I think is quite nice to wrap this whole conversation. So I will ask each of you to give me very, very short top-line reactions to this question. But before that, I would like to reflect and thank you again for your amazing, very valuable insights today. But underlying the discussion today, I think the issue of incentives, right, is at the forefront, very much so. And also, as you mentioned, Dr. Evelyn, issues and very real challenges that we have in terms of, fragile supply chains, data availability for surveillance, how to best identify, where the need is and actually implement and bring the right people to the table. Same as you mentioned, Valeria, at some point, we need a shared roadmap where everyone can play a part, whether this is AI or any other intervention. So I want to ask each of you to answer this question very briefly. And it goes like this. Generally, humans react to positive or negative incentives. In the context of AMR, it has consistently been more of a negative incentive, which from a financial standpoint is not salient. Do you think that we can use any positive incentives in this context? And I will go perhaps first to Dr. Jaideep, Evelyn, Valeria, and lastly, Maria, to close us off.
So thanks, Claudia. I think positive incentives should make people really sit up and think. We have seen some movements of this in Europe, for example, where companies are being rewarded for bringing antibiotics, which perhaps may hardly be used in the country, but at least there is an incentive for people to get in. So I think it should be a good mix, but I think positive incentives should perhaps be rated a little higher than some of the negative incentives.
Dr. Evelyn?
Thank you. I agree that it's important for us to have positive incentives. And I think from our side of the world, conversations around pooled procurements probably might be a positive incentive. And are there possibilities of guaranteeing longer term contracts, for example? We are also having a lot of conversations around local manufacturing on the continent as well. And I think there's a fear from investors that even if I could produce so much, but what's the return at the end of the day? So I think it's an important consideration. And the only way that I think is going to unlock the stalemate ultimately. Thank you.
Valeria?
Thank you for this opportunity. I really enjoyed the comment that was done by Maria about shifting the AMR narrative completely, just bringing risk, burden, failure in this way. I think that we really should reframe our way of addressing AMR in a positive narrative, thinking about linking the invisible with the visible, thinking about antibiotics as an enabler, thinking about how antibiotics will contribute to the future of humanity in a broader sense.
And Maria?
Yes, I will echo that, Valeria. It's exactly how I think if we frame antimicrobials as infrastructure, we then start incentivizing all the positive externalities that effective antimicrobials gives us. And so we can still coexist with the negative things. If we lose them, everything that we're going to lose, we lose surgeries, we lose cancer treatment, we lose all the incredible innovations that we see. However, there's a lot of positive externalities as well. And one thing that we can start, and I think this is how I would like to finish, is that I think the investors that you should have in the room, because Evelyn, I don't think we should have only the companies coming to the tables, but bring the investors as well. I think we need to also bring investors that know infrastructure, that know how to invest in infrastructure. So maybe we are also getting wrong the investors that are in the room when we talk about antimicrobials, because usually we get healthcare specialists, you know, and they know everything about healthcare, they know everything about the new drugs and the new diagnostics, but we actually need investors that understand infrastructure, because infrastructure is normally underfunded, but they still make a lot of money, right? Because they create new assets. So we need to bring these specialists also in the room so they can guide us in how this investment in antimicrobial as infrastructure can be even more precise, more effective, and we can have more investors seeing antimicrobial resistance and effectiveness as something that will protect their portfolios.
So,
thank you very
Claudia, if I
much.
can just say
yeah,
one line
please
more
go
to
ahead.
what Maria said. I really enjoyed what she said, but I think it's also for your next webinar, please bring in an investor as part of the discussion. And what is the message that what is the language that investors understand? Is it just about returns, or is there something else? You know, there is an altruism which should be there in all of us, including the investors.
Thank you so much. I think this is actually an excellent point and actually quite a thought-provoking one for us to end on. Just echoing what Evelyn was saying just now, we may end up with more questions as we go through discussions around AMR. But with that, I would like to sincerely thank all of you, all of the panelists for joining today, everyone who's on the line on behalf of the Access to Medicine Foundation. And the recording for the webinar will be available on our website shortly. Thank you very much again, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.